It was a quiet evening in my two-bedroom house, tucked at the edge of a small Pennsylvania town. Retirement had given me a life I wasn't quite sure how to live. The days blurred into each other. Coffee, morning papers, tinkering with the old truck in the garage, and the occasional fishing trip. That night, the TV flickered with muted baseball highlights. The room dim except for the faint glow of the screen and a floor lamp I never bothered to replace. A sharp knock at the door broke through the stillness. Not a neighborly knock, not the polite rattle of delivery. This was urgent. I shuffled to the door, cautious out of habit, and cracked it open. A woman stood there, mid-30s, blonde hair tied in a loose bun. Her face was pale, drawn tight like she hadn't slept in days. She clutched a worn leather folder against her chest. "Detective Richard Keegan?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Not a detective anymore," I said, keeping my tone steady. "You've got the wrong house." "No, I don't," she blurted. "Please, Mr. Keegan, I need to talk to you. It's about your son." I froze. "You got the wrong man." Her lips tightened as she opened the folder. She pulled out a photograph, a grainy shot of me, 25 years younger, leaning against a patrol car with a woman I hadn't seen since before I made sergeant. I stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. "Start talking." She perched on the edge of my couch, her hands gripping the folder like it might blow away. "My name is Elizabeth Tanner. My son, David, is 16, and he's your son." I leaned against the kitchen counter, arms folded tight across my chest. The words hit me like a sucker punch, leaving me off balance, searching for solid ground. She looked up at me with those eyes that carried a storm, but I wasn't about to let her take control of the room. "You must have lost your damn mind," I said finally, my voice like gravel. "I don't have a son." Elizabeth didn't flinch. "You do," she said firmly, pulling out another photo. This one was of a teenage boy, tall and lanky, with a mop of dark hair that could have been my own when I was his age. "That's David," she continued. "He's been asking questions about his father for years, and I had to dig to even find you. This," she gestured to the folder, "proves everything." I snatched the folder and flipped through it. Inside were old letters, receipts, and a birth certificate with my name scrawled in the father section. There were photos of Elizabeth back in the day, her smile frozen in time, standing outside a courthouse where I used to work. It was all too neat, too convenient. I threw the folder onto the coffee table. "You expect me to believe this?" "I don't expect anything from you," she shot back, her tone sharp now. "But David deserves to know where he comes from, and you owe it to him, to me, to face the truth." I studied her, trying to get a read. She was nervous, but there was something else in her eyes, determination. This wasn't just some scam, but that didn't mean it added up. "Let's say, for argument's sake, that this kid is mine," I said, leaning forward. "Why now? Why not show up years ago?" Elizabeth swallowed hard, her hands tightening around the strap of her bag. "Because I didn't know for sure until recently," she admitted. "David got sick last year. Nothing too serious, but the doctors ran some tests. Something about the blood work didn't add up. It led me back to you." Her voice cracked on the last word. I stayed quiet, letting the silence press down on both of us. "And the dates," I said finally, "they don't match." "They do," she insisted, pulling out yet another piece of paper. It was a calendar marked with circles and notes. "We met in May of '08. You worked on a case involving my brother. We spent one night together, and 9 months later, David." I rubbed my temple, feeling the beginning of a headache claw its way in. "I don't remember you." She flinched like I'd slapped her. "I remember you." The room felt like it was closing in. I grabbed the folder and flipped through it again, searching for anything that might poke holes in her story. But all I found were more questions. "Why didn't you just stay gone?" I muttered, more to myself than her. She stood abruptly, her face hardening. "Because he's my son, and if you have a shred of decency left in you, you'll help us figure this out." "Figure what out?" I barked, standing too. "What do you want from me?" Elizabeth met my glare with one of her own. "I want the truth. That's all. A DNA test, if nothing else. And if it turns out I'm wrong, I'll walk away and never bother you again." I stared her down, my mind racing. The instinct to push her out the door was strong, but there was a whisper in the back of my head, a nagging voice that wouldn't shut up. If she was telling the truth, ignoring her wouldn't change it. And if she was lying, well, I'd deal with that too. Fine, I said at last, my voice flat. We'll do the damn test. But don't expect a warm reunion. I wouldn't dream of it, she snapped, grabbing her bag. I'll set up the appointment and let you know. Thanks for your time, detective. She slammed the door on her way out, leaving me alone with the folder, and a mess I never saw coming. I stared at the folder on the coffee table, its contents spilled out like a crime scene. Old photos, hospital documents, Elizabeth's scribbled notes, pieces of a life that, until tonight, I didn't know existed. The kid's face haunted me. There was something familiar in the tilt of his head, the way his eyes narrowed. Or maybe I was just looking for connections where there were none. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and sank into the couch. The TV still flickered in the background, muted highlights playing to an audience of one. I let my mind drift back to 2008, back to a younger version of myself who had been too consumed with work to pay much attention to anything else. Elizabeth Tanner, the name didn't ring a bell, but the brother she mentioned, that felt like a lead I could pull on. The next morning, I drove into town. The diner was quiet, a handful of regulars sipping coffee and gossiping over pancakes. I found my usual booth in the corner and pulled out my old notepad. Habit dies hard. I jotted down what I knew. Elizabeth Tanner. Brother, 2008 case. Hospital tests. DNA pending. Another cold one, Rick, said Martha, the waitress who'd been serving me since before I had gray in my hair. Not yet. Got my head full of enough ice, I said, flashing her a tight smile. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said, topping off my coffee anyway. Or maybe just a bad memory. You ever hear the name Tanner around here? Elizabeth Tanner? Martha tilted her head, thinking, can't say I do, but that don't mean much. You know, folks come and go in this town faster than we get a new mayor. I nodded, distracted, already flipping through my mental Rolodex. There had been a case in '08, something messy involving a drug ring operating out of a chop shop on the edge of town. One of the witnesses had gone missing, a Tanner, if I wasn't mistaken. I'd worked hard to pull that witness back into the fold, and it had ended in a quick arrest and a trial. After that, I'd moved on. I hadn't thought about it in years. Leaving a tip on the table, I headed to the library. It wasn't much, just a small building tucked behind the courthouse. But the archives had been my lifeline during my years on the force. I logged into the public records terminal and pulled up the case files from 2008. Sure enough, there it was, State versus Valdez. Witness, Tanner Bryan. I clicked on the name and skimmed the file. Brian Tanner, 25 years old, arrested in connection with a string of robberies. Turned state's witness after being cornered in a warehouse sting. I vaguely remembered him. Twitchy, nervous, the kind of guy who'd sell his own shadow if it meant a reduced sentence. Then there it was, family contact, Elizabeth Tanner. I leaned back, the pieces clicking into place. She'd been the sister who showed up in court, the one who begged us to keep her brother safe. I remembered her now, short blonde hair, sharp eyes that hadn't matched her soft voice. I'd been too busy keeping Brian alive to pay much attention to her. But why the hell would she wait 16 years to drop this bombshell? I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It rang 3 times before a gravelly voice picked up. Keegan, you old bastard. Thought you were dead. Nice to hear you too, Bill. Still keeping tabs on the old cases? Somebody has too. You calling for a trip down memory lane? Or is this about something real? 2008 Valdez case. Brian Tanner. Need to know if he's still around. There was a pause, then the sound of keys clicking on a keyboard. Tanner. Brian Tanner died 3 years ago. Overdose. I rubbed my temple. What about his sister? No criminal record. She's clean, as far as I can tell. Anything about a kid? No. Why? You got something I should know about? I hung up without answering. That evening, Elizabeth called with details about the DNA test. The appointment was set for Friday, and she texted me the address of the clinic. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the tension behind it. She wanted answers as much as I did. Maybe more. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the boy's face again. David. If he was mine, what the hell kind of father had I been without even knowing it? And if he wasn't, What kind of game was Elizabeth playing? Friday couldn't come fast enough. The clinic was tucked between a laundromat and a payday loan store on a street that had seen better days. The neon sign buzzed faintly in the daylight, proclaiming East Side Diagnostics in letters that were missing a few bulbs. I parked the truck and sat there for a minute, staring at the entrance. This wasn't just another case, not something I could wrap up in a report and forget about. The questions Elizabeth had raised weren't going anywhere, and after 16 years, I wasn't sure I wanted the answers. When I finally pushed through the glass door, Elizabeth was already there. She sat on a hard plastic chair, the kind that made your back ache if you stayed too long. A boy sat beside her, slouched over his phone, earbuds in, oblivious. My chest tightened. He looked up as I approached. Those eyes. Jesus, they could have been my own. The same piercing look I saw in the mirror every morning, softened by youth but unmistakable. Elizabeth stood, smoothing her blouse. David, she said, her voice gentle. This is Richard Keegan. The boy pulled out one earbud and gave me a slow once-over. You're the guy? He asked, his tone flat, unimpressed. I gave him a nod. Guess so. David shrugged and went back to his phone. Cool. Elizabeth cleared her throat. The nurse said they're ready for us. We followed her to the reception desk, where a bored-looking woman in scrubs handed us clipboards. The paperwork was straightforward, just enough legalese to cover the clinic's ass. Elizabeth hovered, watching me scribble my name, as if making sure I wouldn't bolt. The nurse led us to a small room in the back. We'll take a buccal swab from each of you, she explained, holding up a long cotton swab sealed in plastic. It's quick and painless. David went first, pulling the earbuds out completely for the first time. He sat on the edge of the chair, his shoulders stiff as the nurse swiped the inside of his cheek. When it was my turn, I tried to act nonchalant, but the weight of the moment pressed down on me. The nurse handed the swabs off to a tech who disappeared into the back. That's it, David asked, leaning back. That's it, Elizabeth confirmed, her voice tight. The nurse told us the results would take a few days, then handed us an envelope with a tracking code, so we could access them online. The three of us filed out in silence. David peeled off at the curb, pulling a skateboard from Elizabeth's trunk. Later, he mumbled, already rolling away before either of us could respond. Elizabeth sighed. He's not great with emotions. No kidding. We stood there for a moment, the air between us heavy. Finally, I broke the silence. If this comes back positive, what then? Her jaw tightened. I don't know, she admitted. But I want him to know his father, even if it's messy. He deserves that. I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. She climbed in her car and drove off, leaving me alone on the sidewalk. The days that followed crawled by. I threw myself into busy work, repairing the shed, tinkering with the old truck, anything to keep my mind from wandering. But no matter how hard I worked, the doubt and the memories kept creeping in. I'd always been careful, meticulous. It was part of what made me a damn good detective. But if I'd been reckless once, just once, what did that say about me? Finally, the email came. The subject line was simple: DNA results available. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen, my finger hovering over the mouse. Part of me wanted to delete it, pretend this never happened. But there was no going back. I clicked the link and entered the tracking code. The results loaded, line by line, until the words were staring me in the face. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. I leaned back in my chair, the air sucked from the room. The boy was mine, 16 years. I'd been a father for 16 years and hadn't known it. The phone buzzed on the desk. Elizabeth's name lit up the screen. I picked it up and answered, my voice rough. I saw. Me too, she said softly. What now? I stared out the window, the neighborhood blurring into nothing. I don't know, I admit it, but I guess we figure it out. The truck rattled down the cracked asphalt road, a thermos of coffee clinking against the console. Elizabeth had asked me to meet her and David at a diner on the edge of town. Neutral ground, she called it. Seemed more like a battleground to me. The diner was the kind of place that hadn't changed in 50 years. Vinyl booths patched with duct tape, the faint smell of grease hanging in the air, and a jukebox in the corner playing soft country ballads. Elizabeth was already there, sitting in a booth by the window, David was next to her, earbuds in, his fingers tapping on his phone screen like a nervous tick. I slid into the seat across from them, the plastic cushion creaking under my weight. A waitress appeared, pouring coffee into my mug without asking. David didn't look up, his attention glued to whatever game he was playing. Elizabeth cleared her throat. "David," she said gently, "put that away." He rolled his eyes, but slipped the phone into his pocket. His gaze flicked to me, and then out the window. "So, what now?" His question hung in the air. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "What do you want to know?" "Dunno," he muttered. "You're a detective, right?" "Used to be," I said. "I'm retired now." David smirked, a hint of rebellion creeping into his tone. "Sounds boring." "It is," I shot back. "But it's better than getting shot at." He shrugged, clearly unimpressed. Elizabeth gave me a look that said, "Try harder." "Listen," I said, turning to him. "I didn't know about you. If I had, things would have been different." "Yeah? Like what?" he asked, leaning back in his seat, arms crossed. "Like I would have been there," I said simply. "At least, I would have tried to be." His jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. The kid had walls up, and I couldn't blame him. I'd spent 16 years on the outside of his life. "How do you make up for that?" Elizabeth jumped in, her voice soft but firm. "David, he's here now. That has to count for something." David's gaze shifted to the window again, his face a mix of skepticism and something else. Hope, maybe, buried deep. "We'll see," he said finally. The conversation shifted after that, moving into safer territory. I asked him about school, sports, the stuff teenagers usually had opinions on. He gave short answers, but didn't shut down completely. It was a start. After an hour, Elizabeth excused herself to take a call outside, leaving the two of us alone. The silence stretched between us, awkward and heavy. Finally, David spoke up. "Why'd you stop being a detective?" I took a sip of coffee, weighing my words. It was time. Too many cases like the one your uncle was involved in. Too much baggage. He nodded, not pressing further. But his curiosity lingered in his expression. "You think you want to do something like that one day?" I asked. He snorted. "Nah, too many rules." I smirked. "You'd be surprised how many rules you learn to bend." David actually cracked a smile at that, the first real one I'd seen from him. It didn't last long, but it was something. Elizabeth came back in, sliding into the booth. "Everything okay?" she asked, glancing between us. I nodded. "We're good." Over the next few weeks, I tried to carve out space in David's life. It wasn't easy. He wasn't the kind of kid who made things simple. He'd dodge my calls, show up late when we planned to meet, and brush off most of my attempts at conversation. But every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something real, a connection I couldn't quite name but felt deep in my gut. One Saturday, I took him out to a car show at the fairgrounds. The kid had a thing for engines, it turned out, and I figured it was neutral ground where we could talk without the pressure. As we walked between rows of polished steel and chrome, he started asking questions about the engines, the horsepower, the history. For the first time, he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. "This one's a beast," I said, pointing to a '69 Charger. 440 Magnum engine, built for speed and power. David ran his hand along the hood, his eyes wide. "Think we could get one?" I laughed. "Not unless you win the lottery. But maybe we could find a fixer-upper." That got him smiling again, and for a moment, it felt like we weren't strangers anymore. The cracks in the past started showing around then. Elizabeth had been careful, but I could tell there was more to her story. Late one night, after David had gone to bed, she called me. "There's something you need to know," she said, her voice tense. "About Brian." I gripped the phone tighter. "What is it?" "Before he died, he told me something about the case. Something about why he turned himself in." My stomach nodded. "Spit it out, Elizabeth." She hesitated, and then the words came tumbling out. "He said someone paid him to stay quiet, to take the fall." My blood ran cold. I thought I'd closed that chapter years ago, but now it felt like it was about to blow wide open. Elizabeth's words rattled around in my head long after the call ended. Brian Tanner, paid to take the fall? It didn't make sense. Back then, he'd seemed like a guy cornered, a small-time crook scrambling to save himself. But if someone had been pulling the strings, the case wasn't as clean as I thought. I sat at my desk, staring at the folder Elizabeth had left behind weeks ago. Among the old photos and scattered notes, I searched for anything that might hint at who could have been behind this. Brian's rap sheet, the court transcripts, even the list of witnesses, it all felt familiar, but now it carried the weight of something I'd missed. My mind drifted back to 2008. Brian had been picked up in a warehouse sting, along with 2 other low-level players. The bust had been a turning point in dismantling the Valdez operation, but it had been fast, almost too fast. We'd barely needed to pressure Brian before he flipped, offering everything we needed on a silver platter. At the time, I'd chalked it up to fear. Now I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I drove to the one person who might have answers, Bill Carter, my former partner. Bill had been my right-hand man during those years, and if there were any details I'd missed, he might have them. He opened the door to his ranch house, looking like retirement had treated him better than me. "Keegan," he said, stepping aside, "didn't expect to see you on my porch. Come in." We sat at his kitchen table, mugs of coffee between us. I laid it out for him. Elizabeth, the DNA results, Brian's death, and her claim about the payoff. Bill leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You're telling me someone paid Brian to keep his mouth shut?" "That's what his sister says," I replied. "And you believe her?" "Don't know yet," I admitted. "But it feels off. Like we missed something." Bill scratched his chin, staring at the table. "You remember Valdez's lawyer? Slick bastard. Always found a way to muddy the waters." "Martinez," I said, the name clicking into place. "Yeah, Martinez. If there's any truth to this, he'd be the one to dig into. That guy didn't take a dump without an angle." I nodded. "I'll start there." The next stop was the courthouse. The records department was a maze of dusty files and disinterested clerks, but after some polite persistence and a little charm, I managed to pull the files on the Valdez case. Martinez's name popped up over and over, a constant thorn in the side of every prosecutor who tried to pin something on his client. One document stood out, a motion Martinez filed to suppress Brian's initial statement. It was boilerplate legal maneuvering, but something about the timing felt odd. He filed it 2 days after Brian agreed to testify, almost as if he was stalling for time. I copied the document and decided to pay Martinez a visit. He was still practicing law out of a sleek downtown office, a far cry from the courtroom brawler I remembered. His secretary greeted me with a practiced smile, but it faltered when I introduced myself. "I'll see if Mr. Martinez is available," she said, disappearing into the back. Moments later, Martinez himself appeared. His tailored suit and graying hair gave him an air of authority, but his smirk was the same as ever. "Detective Keegan," he said, extending a hand. "What brings you to my humble office?" "Just a friendly chat," I said, not taking the hand. He motioned to a chair in his glass-walled office. I sat, watching as he settled into the leather chair opposite me. "You remember Brian Tanner?" I asked. Martinez's smirk faltered for a split second. "Of course. He was cooperative. That's one word for it," I said. "He's dead now, but his sister's been asking questions. So someone paid him to keep quiet back in '08. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" His smile returned, colder now. "Detective, I represent a lot of people. I can't recall every detail of every case. But if Brian took money, it certainly didn't come from me. Did it come from Valdez?" He chuckled. "I think we're done here." "Not yet," I said, leaning forward. "If there's a paper trail, I'll find it. And when I do, I'll make sure it leads right back to your door." Martinez's eyes narrowed. "Careful, detective. Retirement doesn't make you untouchable." I left his office with more questions than answers. If Martinez was hiding something, he wasn't going to give it up easily. But his reaction confirmed one thing. Elizabeth was right. There was more to Brian's story, and whatever it wasn't over yet. Back at home, I poured a glass of whiskey and stared out the window. The quiet hum of the neighborhood was a stark contrast to the storm brewing in my mind. David deserved the truth, even if it meant unraveling the mess I thought I'd left behind. The phone buzzed on the counter. It was Elizabeth. "Did you find anything?" she asked. "Not yet," I said, "but I've got a lead." "Be careful," she said, her voice tight. "If someone paid Brian back then, they won't want you digging now." I'm not stopping, I said firmly. Neither am I, she replied. Let me know what you need. For the first time, I believed her. The whiskey burned its way down, settling into a low warmth in my chest. I sat at the kitchen table, the Valdez case file spread out in front of me. The shadows outside stretched long, the evening closing in. Somewhere in this mess was the truth. And if Brian Tanner had been bought, someone had made sure it was buried deep. The phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Elizabeth. David wants to see you tomorrow. Lunch? I typed back a quick response. Where? Same diner. Noon. The next day, I arrived early, hoping to get a few minutes alone before David showed up. The familiar hum of conversation and clink of silverware greeted me as I slid into the booth. A coffee cup appeared in front of me, steam curling up into the stale diner air. David walked in a few minutes later, earbuds dangling from his ears. He spotted me, hesitated, then made his way over. He didn't sit right away, instead standing there, awkward, like he wasn't sure where to start. You ordering or what? I said, breaking the tension. He smirked, barely, but slid into the booth across from me. You always this friendly? Only on my good days. The waitress appeared, notepad in hand, and we both ordered burgers. After she left, David leaned back in the booth, his arms crossed. Mom said you used to be a detective. Yeah, so like, you caught bad guys and stuff? That's the idea. He nodded, staring out the window. What made you stop? The kid had a way of asking questions that cut right to the bone. I took a sip of coffee, thinking about how to answer. It takes a toll, I said finally. Some things you can't unsee, and some cases stick with you longer than they should. He nodded again, like he understood more than I expected. The burgers arrived, giving us an excuse to shift gears. We ate in relative silence. The only sounds the clatter of plates and the low murmur of the diner. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, looking for pieces of myself in his mannerisms. The way he hunched over his food, the way his jaw tensed when he was deep in thought, it was like looking in a mirror. As we finished up, David finally spoke again. You think my uncle really got paid to keep quiet? I froze mid-sip. Your mom told you about that? She tells me everything, he said, almost defensively. So, do you? I set the coffee cup down, leaning forward. I don't know yet, but I'm looking into it. He nodded, his gaze steady. Good. That one word carried more weight than I expected. He wasn't just curious, he wanted answers. And maybe, just maybe, he wanted to trust me. That evening, I returned to the Valdez files, determined to dig deeper. Martinez, the slick lawyer, had been too quick to dismiss me, and his reaction felt off. If he was hiding something, I needed leverage. I pulled out my laptop and began searching for connections. Martinez's client list was a who's who of shady characters, many of them tied to organized crime. But one name stood out, Joseph Valdez. Not the main target of the 2008 case, but a cousin, one who'd slipped through the cracks. Joseph had been listed as a known associate in the case file, but he'd disappeared after the sting. A quick search pulled up his name again, tied to a small import-export business on the edge of town. The address looked familiar, and I realized why. It was close to where Brian Tanner had been arrested. I grabbed my jacket and keys. If Joseph Valdez was still in business, he might have answers, or at least a reason to cover his tracks. The warehouse was dark, its windows boarded up, but the faint hum of machinery came from inside. I parked the truck down the block and approached on foot, sticking to the shadows. A side door hung slightly ajar, just enough to make me think someone wanted visitors. Inside, the air smelled of grease and metal. The warehouse floor was cluttered with crates and pallets, the hum of machinery coming from the far end. I moved quietly, my eyes scanning for any signs of life. I didn't have to wait long. A voice echoed through the space, low and tense. We're not moving anything until I say so. Got it? I edged closer, keeping to the cover of the crates. Two men stood near a forklift, their backs to me. One of them was tall, with a lean build and a sharp jawline that matched the mugshot from Joseph Valdez's file. The other man was stockier, his face hidden by a baseball cap. They were too far away to make out details, but their tone made it clear they weren't discussing anything legal. You sure Martinez is on board? The stocky man asked. Valdez laughed. He doesn't have a choice. As long as the money keeps flowing, he'll keep his mouth shut. That was all I needed to hear. I slipped back the way I came, my mind racing. If Martinez was involved, he was more than just a lawyer. He was part of the operation, a linchpin holding the whole thing together. As I climbed into my truck and pulled away, I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but I had to move carefully. One wrong step, and I'd be the next ghost this case buried. The engine growled as I sped away from the warehouse, my mind churning with the weight of what I'd overheard. Martinez was in this up to his neck, and Joseph Valdez wasn't just some loose end. He was still running the game, still pulling strings. Brian Tanner hadn't just been bought. He'd been silenced. My phone buzzed on the seat next to me, pulling me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the screen. It was Elizabeth. "What's up?" I asked, keeping one hand on the wheel. "David's been asking more questions," she said. Her voice was tight, like she was holding something back. "About you. About Brian. I think he's starting to piece things together." "Good," I said flatly. "He deserves to know." There was a pause on the other end. "And what about you? What have you found?" I debated how much to tell her. "Joseph Valdez is still in play," I said finally. "And Martinez isn't just a lawyer. He's part of whatever's still going on." Elizabeth exhaled sharply. "What does that mean for us?" "It means we're not done. Not by a long shot." The next morning, I sat in my truck outside David's school. The bell rang, and kids started pouring out, laughing and jostling each other on their way to buses or waiting cars. David appeared in the crowd, earbuds in, his backpack slung lazily over one shoulder. I honked the horn. His head snapped up, and he spotted me. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone more curious than annoyed. "Thought you might want to ride home," I said, gesturing to the passenger seat. He climbed in without a word, pulling his earbuds out. As I pulled onto the road, the silence stretched between us. "You still looking into Uncle Brian?" he asked suddenly. "Yeah," I said. Turns out there's more to his story than I thought. David glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Like what?" "Like someone paid him off to keep quiet," I said. "And the people who did it are still out there." David leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed. "Why would he take the money?" "Maybe he didn't think he had a choice," I said. "Or maybe he thought it would protect your mom." That seemed to hit a nerve. David stared out the window, his jaw tightening. "He was always protecting her," he muttered. "What do you mean?" He shook his head. "Nothing. Just forget it." I didn't press him. The kid was carrying more weight than I realized, and I needed to tread carefully if I wanted to earn his trust. That night, I pulled the Valdez case files out again, spreading them across the dining table. The warehouse visit had confirmed my suspicions, but I needed proof, something that would tie Martinez and Joseph Valdez to the payout Brian had taken. I was halfway through a stack of depositions when I found it, a wire transfer dated 2 days before Brian flipped. The account was offshore, untraceable at first glance, but the sender was listed as a shell company tied to Martinez's firm. I stared at the document, the pieces clicking into place. Martinez had funneled the money to Brian, ensuring his silence. And now that I was digging into it, I had a target on my back. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Bill. "Keegan," he said, his voice low. "I've been poking around like you asked. And you're not going to like it," he said. "Joseph Valdez isn't just running a little operation. He's got a whole network, and they're watching anyone who gets too close." "What does that mean for us?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "It means you're in deep, my friend. Watch your back." The next day, I met Elizabeth at her house. She was pacing the living room, her face pale and drawn. "We need to talk," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Go ahead." She handed me a folder. Inside were photos, grainy, taken at a distance, but unmistakable. One showed me outside the warehouse. Another was of David and me at the diner. The last one was of Elizabeth herself, sitting on her porch. "They've been watching us," she said, her voice trembling. "Whoever you're digging into, they know." I clenched my jaw, anger bubbling just under the surface. "Good. Means we're getting close." "Close to what?" "Getting killed," she snapped. "You need to stop, Richard. For David's sake. For all of us." I shook my head. Stopping isn't an option. Not now. Elizabeth grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. This isn't just about the past. They're dangerous, Richard. If you keep pushing, I've dealt with dangerous people before, I said, cutting her off, and I'm not stopping until I find out the truth. Elizabeth's grip tightened, but she didn't say anything. The silence between us was heavy, charged with all the things we couldn't say. Finally, she let go. Just be careful, she said quietly. I will. As I left her house, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to spiral out of control. The deeper I dug, the more dangerous it became. Not just for me, but for David and Elizabeth. But walking away wasn't in my nature. This time, I wasn't just fighting for justice. I was fighting for my family. The air was heavy with the kind of tension that makes your shoulders knot up. Driving back to my place, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The occasional car lingered too long in my rear view, headlights burning into the back of my skull. But every time I made a turn, the shadow fell away. Maybe I was just paranoid, or maybe not paranoid enough. I parked the truck 2 streets down from my house and walked the rest of the way, sticking to the shadows. If they were watching, they wouldn't find me sitting like a target in the living room. Inside, I locked the doors and pulled the blinds tight. The house felt different now, like it wasn't mine anymore. Every corner seemed to hum with unseen eyes. Every creak in the floorboards a reminder of how exposed I was. I needed to make my next move, and I needed to do it fast. The next morning, I met Bill at his favorite coffee shop, a hole-in-the-wall place that served the strongest brew in town. He was already seated when I walked in, a newspaper folded neatly in front of him. You look like hell, he said, sliding a coffee across the table. Thanks for noticing, I muttered, dropping into the seat opposite him. Got anything new for me? He nodded, his face grim. Remember that offshore account tied to Martinez? It wasn't a one-time thing. Money's been moving in and out of it for years. And guess who's been dipping his hand in the pot? Joseph Valdez, I said. Bill shook his head. Bigger. Martinez has been moving cash for people way above Valdez's pay grade. We're talking cartel connections. The words hit me like a gut punch. This wasn't just about Brian Tanner anymore. I was staring down a network of corruption that reached far beyond one crooked lawyer and his criminal client. What's the play? I asked. You're not going to like it, Bill said, leaning in. We need to take this to the feds. No, I said firmly. Not yet. Keegan, you don't have the resources for this. They do. They also have leaks, I countered. If we go to the feds, Martinez and Valdez will know before the ink dries. We need proof, something they can't bury. Bill sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. You're playing with fire. You know that? Story of my life, I said. That evening, I drove back to the warehouse. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. I parked a block away and approached on foot, keeping to the shadows. This time, I came prepared, a digital recorder in one pocket and a compact camera in the other. The side door was still ajar, and I slipped inside, my footsteps muffled by the layer of grime on the floor. The machinery was silent now, the air heavy with the scent of oil and rust. I crept toward the back, where I'd seen Valdez and his associate before. Voices drifted from an office at the far end of the warehouse. I flattened myself against the wall, edging closer until I could make out their conversation. You think Keegan's going to back off? One voice said. It was Valdez, unmistakably. He's stubborn, another voice replied. Martinez. But stubborn doesn't mean invincible. If he keeps digging, we'll handle it. And the sister? What about her? She doesn't matter. Without her brother, she's got nothing. My grip tightened on the recorder in my pocket. They knew about Elizabeth. They'd known from the start. Valdez laughed, a low, cold sound. If Keegan wants to play hero, let him. It'll just make it easier to bury him. I'd heard enough. I slipped out the way I came, my heart pounding. They weren't just trying to cover up the past. They were planning to eliminate anyone who got in their way. Back at home, I uploaded the audio file to my computer and sent a copy to Bill. It wasn't the smoking gun we needed, but it was a start. Then I called Elizabeth. They're watching you, I said as soon as she picked up. You need to stay out of sight. What do you mean? She asked, her voice tight. I mean Martinez and Valdez are onto you. They think you're a loose end. There was a pause on the other end. What about David? I'll keep him safe, I said. But you need to lay low. I can't just disappear, she argued. David. David needs you alive. I snapped. Do you understand me? She went quiet, and I could hear the weight of my words sinking in. Fine, she said finally, but you'd better be right about this. I am, I said, and when this is over, you'll thank me. The next few days were a blur of planning and surveillance. I knew the clock was ticking, and every move I made felt like a step closer to the edge. But I wasn't backing down. Not this time. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about protecting the people I cared about. And if Martinez and Valdez wanted to fight, they'd picked the wrong man to push. The next morning, the storm broke. Not the weather. Clear skies stretched across town. But the tension that had been building finally exploded. I was in the middle of packing a go-bag, just in case when the phone rang. It wasn't Elizabeth or Bill. It was a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. You're making this harder than it needs to be, a smooth voice said. Martinez. Walk away, Keegan. Take your son, your new life, and let the past stay buried. I clenched the phone tighter. You think I scare that easy? You should, he said, his tone ice cold. We've been watching you, and if you keep pushing, you won't like where this ends. The line went dead. I dropped the phone onto the counter, the weight of his words settling like a lead blanket. He wasn't bluffing. They knew about Elizabeth, about David, maybe about Bill, and they were willing to do whatever it took to shut me down. That afternoon, I picked David up from school. He slid into the truck, earbuds in as usual, but I noticed the tension in his shoulders. He glanced at me, then looked out the window. You okay? I asked, keeping my tone even. Yeah, he muttered. Just tired. He wasn't telling me everything, but I let it slide. For now. We drove in silence for a while before he finally spoke. Mom said you're trying to protect us. That's right. From what? I glanced at him, then back at the road. Bad people. He snorted. That's vague. Because it's complicated, I said. But trust me, kid, I'm not letting anything happen to you or your mom. He didn't respond, but the way he shifted in his seat told me he was listening. That evening, I met Bill at a parking garage downtown. The place was deserted, the echoes of our footsteps bouncing off the concrete walls. He handed me a folder, his face grim. You're not going to like this, he said. I flipped it open. Inside were surveillance photos, me, Elizabeth, David, even Bill himself. Alongside them were dossiers, detailed to the point of paranoia. Martinez had done his homework. This is what they have on us. I asked, my stomach twisting. It's worse, Bill said. They've been cleaning house. Anyone connected to the Valdez operation who could talk gone. Accidents, overdoses, disappearances. These guys aren't just playing defense. They're making sure there's no one left to testify. The words hit like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about silencing me or Elizabeth. It was about erasing anyone who could expose the truth. What do we do? I asked. Bill hesitated. We go public. Leak what we have. Make enough noise that they can't sweep it under the rug. I shook my head. Not yet. If we move too soon, they'll bury us before the story gets out. We need a hammer. A piece of evidence they can't ignore. And how do you plan to get that? Bill asked. By going straight to the source, I said, Joseph Valdez. That night, I parked outside Valdez's warehouse, the recorder in my pocket, and my Glock holstered at my side. This wasn't just about gathering evidence anymore. This was about survival. I slipped inside the warehouse, my movements slow and deliberate. The place was quiet, the hum of machinery replaced by an eerie stillness. My gut told me this wasn't going to be easy. Voices echoed from the back office, faint but distinct. I crept closer, my hand hovering near my weapon. Peering around the corner, I saw Valdez and Martinez deep in conversation. A briefcase sat open on the desk between them, stacks of cash spilling out. Keegan's a problem, Martinez was saying. He's digging too deep. Valdez leaned back in his chair, his expression calm. Then make him stop. Martinez smirked. I have a plan for that. I didn't wait to hear more. Stepping into the room, I leveled the Glock at them. Let's talk. Martinez's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of panic. Valdez, on the other hand, looked almost amused. Well, if it isn't the retired detective, Valdez said, leaning forward. What brings you to my humble office? Answers, I said. And maybe some insurance. Martinez's hand drifted toward the desk drawer, but I shook my head. Don't. He froze, his hand hovering. You've got no idea what you're stepping into, he said. Enlighten me, I said. Tell me why you paid Brian Tanner to take the fall. Tell me why you're still cleaning up loose ends. Valdez laughed, a low, menacing sound. You think you're some kind of hero? You're just a washed-up cop playing a game you can't win. Maybe, I said, but I've got a lot less to lose than you do. The tension in the room was a live wire, humming with the potential for disaster. My finger hovered over the trigger, my pulse pounding in my ears. Last chance, I said. Start talking. Valdez leaned back in his chair, his smirk sharp enough to cut glass. You think walking in here with a gun changes anything? You're out of your depth, Keegan. Funny, I said, keeping the Glock trained on him. You didn't seem so calm when I was outside your warehouse last time. Maybe you're starting to feel the heat. Martinez shifted uneasily, his eyes darting to the briefcase on the table. You're making a mistake, detective. Retired detective, I said. And the only mistake I've made so far was not digging into you two sooner. Valdez gestured to the briefcase. You want money? Take it. Disappear. This doesn't have to end badly for you. I laughed. A dry, humorless sound. You think I'm here for a payout? That's cute. No, I'm here for the truth. And I'm not leaving until I get it. The tension in the room thickened. Martinez opened his mouth to say something, but Valdez silenced him with a wave of his hand. Fine, Valdez said, his voice cold. You want the truth? Brian Tanner was a pawn. He was never supposed to survive long enough to talk. I stepped closer, my grip on the gun steady. And Elizabeth? What about her? She's irrelevant, Valdez said with a shrug. Just a sister clinging to memories of her screw-up brother. She doesn't know anything. That's where you're wrong, I said. She knows you paid him. She knows Martinez funneled the money through a shell company. And now, so do I. Martinez's face turned pale, but Valdez didn't flinch. What do you think you're going to do with that information? Take it to the cops? The feds? You think they'll listen to a disgraced ex-detective with a chip on his shoulder? They will, I said, because I've got recordings, and I'm not the only one who knows what's going on. For the first time, Valdez's smirk faltered. You're bluffing. Try me, I said, my tone ice cold. The room went silent. Martinez shifted nervously, his gaze flicking to Valdez as if waiting for permission to act. Valdez, however, seemed to be weighing his options. You're not as dumb as you look, Valdez said finally. But that doesn't mean you'll walk out of here alive. The threat hung in the air, but I didn't blink. Then I'd better make it count. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. Valdez and Martinez tensed, their attention snapping to the door. I kept my gun steady, but my heart was hammering in my chest. Reinforcements? I couldn't take on more than the two of them. The door burst open, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Bill, his Glock drawn. Hope I'm not late to the party, he said, his voice low and steady. Martinez cursed under his breath, his bravado evaporating. Valdez, however, looked almost impressed. Two washed-up cops, Valdez said, shaking his head. You're outmatched. Maybe, Bill said, stepping further into the room. But we're not leaving empty-handed. Valdez's gaze flicked between us, calculating. Finally, he gestured to Martinez. Give him the files. What? Martinez sputtered. You can't. Do it, Valdez snapped. Martinez glared at us, but moved to a filing cabinet in the corner. He pulled out a thick folder and tossed it onto the table. There, he spat. Now get the hell out. I grabbed the folder, tucking it under my arm. This isn't over, I said, backing toward the door. Not by a long shot. Valdez smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. We'll see about that. Outside, Bill and I moved quickly to the truck. The adrenaline was still pumping through my veins as I climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door. That was bold even for you, Bill said, tossing his gun onto the dashboard. What's in the folder? We'll find out soon enough, I said, peeling out of the parking lot. But whatever it is, it's going to blow this thing wide open. Back at my house, we spread the contents of the folder across the dining table. Bank statements, offshore accounts, memos, all of it pointed to a vast web of corruption. Martinez and Valdez weren't just running a criminal operation. They were laundering money for some of the biggest names in organized crime. This is enough to bury them, Bill said, his voice tinged with disbelief. But they're going to come after you, Keegan. You know that, right? Let them, I said. I'm done running. As we worked through the night, the weight of what we'd uncovered settled over us. This wasn't just about Brian Tanner anymore. It was about a system that had been rotting from the inside for years. And now I had the means to expose it. The only question was whether I'd survive long enough to see it through. The next morning, the tension was so thick it felt like it seeped into my coffee. The folder with the evidence was sitting on the table, staring back at me like it had a life of its own. Bill was on the couch, his arms crossed, his expression grim. Neither of us had slept. We can't sit on this for long, Bill said, breaking the silence. The longer we hold on to it, the more time they have to make a move. They already made their move, I said, pointing to the surveillance photos spread out next to the folder. They're watching us. They think intimidation will scare me off. And if it doesn't, he asked, you really ready for the next step? I nodded, my jaw set. Yeah, we go public. I called Elizabeth later that morning, her voice tense when she answered. What's going on, Richard? I've got what we need, I said. Proof that Martinez and Valdez have been laundering money and tying up loose ends, including Brian. There was a pause on the other end. What does that mean for us? For David? It means they're in damage control mode, I said. But this is bigger than just us. I'm taking it to the press. Elizabeth's voice rose, panic creeping in. The press? Are you insane? They'll come after you. And us. They already are, I said calmly. The only way to stop this is to shine a light on it. Once it's out there, they can't touch us without drawing more attention to themselves. She exhaled sharply. What about David? He's just a kid. He doesn't deserve to be dragged into this. I'll protect him, I said. No matter what. By noon, I was sitting across from a reporter at a downtown coffee shop. She was young, sharp-eyed, and skeptical, but as I laid out the evidence, her expression shifted. By the time I finished, she looked equal parts horrified and exhilarated. This is huge, she said, flipping through the documents. But you understand what this means, right? These people don't play nice. I'm counting on that, I said. You run the story. Make it airtight. I'll take the heat. She hesitated, clearly weighing the risks. Finally, she nodded. Give me 24 hours. That night, I sat with David in the garage, the two of us tinkering with an old carburetor I'd been meaning to rebuild. It was the first time he'd shown any real interest in spending time with me, and I wasn't about to waste it. This thing's ancient, he said, holding up a rusty piece of the carburetor. Yeah, I said, but it still has life left in it. Just needs the right tools. He smirked. You always this philosophical? Only when I'm tired, I said, grinning. David's expression turned serious. Mom told me you're doing something dangerous. I set the carburetor down, meeting his gaze. I am, but it's the right thing to do. He looked down at his hands, fidgeting with a wrench. Are you scared? I thought about it. Yeah, but sometimes you've got to face the fear head on. That's how you protect the people you care about. David nodded, his expression thoughtful. For the first time, I saw a flicker of trust in his eyes. I get it, he said quietly. Just don't get yourself killed, okay? I ruffled his hair, earning an annoyed grunt. I'll do my best. The next morning, the story hit the headlines. Corruption network exposed. Former detective uncovers decade-long money laundering operation. The article detailed everything. Martinez's offshore accounts, Valdez's operation, and the payoffs to silence witnesses. My name was front and center, along with Bill's. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. My phone rang off the hook. Reporters, lawyers, old colleagues, all wanting a piece of the story. But the call I'd been dreading came that afternoon. It was Martinez. You just signed your death warrant, he said, his voice cold and measured. Funny, I said. I was about to say the same to you. You think this is over? You think you're safe because you ran to the press? He let out a humorless laugh. You've made a very powerful enemy, Keegan. Good, I said. Now everyone knows where to look if I go missing. He hung up, the line going dead. I knew the next move was theirs, and I had to be ready. Bill and I fortified my house. Extra locks, cameras, even a safe room in the basement. Elizabeth and David stayed at her parents' place under the guise of a family visit. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best I could do on short notice. The waiting was the worst part. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow outside the window felt like a threat. But I wasn't backing down. That night, as I sat in the darkened living room, my Glock resting on the coffee table, I thought about everything that had led to this moment. Brian, Tanner, Elizabeth, David, they were the reason I was still fighting. The reason I couldn't stop. And when the attack came, I'd be ready. The first sign came at 2:47 a.m. The motion sensor light in the backyard flicked on, its cold white glow flooding the overgrown grass and the tool shed. My heart thudded once, hard, and then settled into a steady rhythm. I was ready for this. I grabbed the Glock from the coffee table and moved to the back of the house, staying low and quiet. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but I knew the layout better than anyone. I glanced out the kitchen window, my eyes scanning the yard. Nothing moved, but the light stayed on, burning brighter than the moon. Then I heard it, the faint scrape of something metallic against the side of the house. I exhaled slowly and moved toward the sound, keeping the gun trained low. When I reached the back door, I crouched and looked through the glass panel. A figure stood near the shed, their silhouette barely visible against the shadows. They were crouched down, working on something near the foundation. I flicked the safety off the Glock and unlocked the door as quietly as I could. Stepping outside, I kept the gun steady, aiming at the ground near the intruder's feet. "Hands up," I said, my voice low but firm. The figure froze. Slowly, they raised their hands, a flashlight clattering to the ground. As I stepped closer, the light from the motion sensor revealed a man dressed in black, his face partially hidden by a balaclava. "Turn around." Slowly, I ordered. He complied, his eyes locking onto mine. They were sharp, calculating, and unafraid. That's what worried me. "Who sent you?" I asked, keeping the Glock steady. He smirked. "You already know." "Martinez?" The smirk widened. "You've made some powerful enemies, old man." I stepped closer, the barrel of the Glock now leveled at his chest. "Why are you here?" "To send a message," he said, his voice calm. "You got a kid, right?" "Be a shame if—" I didn't let him finish. The butt of the Glock connected with his jaw before the words could leave his mouth. He crumpled to the ground, groaning, his hands clutching his face. "Wrong answer," I muttered, stepping on his chest to keep him down. "Try again." He spit blood onto the dirt, his smirk replaced with a grimace. "You think this ends with me?" "There's more coming." "Good," I said. "I'll be ready." I grabbed the zip ties I'd stashed in my jacket pocket and secured his hands behind his back. Dragging him to his feet, I shoved him into a chair I kept in the shed. "You're going to sit here until the cops arrive," I said, pulling out my phone. "And when they do, you're going to tell them everything." "Yeah," he said, his grin returning despite the blood trickling from his mouth. "You think I'm scared of the cops? I'll be out in hours." "You might be," I said, dialing Bill's number. "But not before I get what I need." By the time Bill arrived, the guy in the chair was slumped forward, his breathing shallow but steady. Bill took one look at him and shook his head. "You're a magnet for trouble," he said, pulling out a notepad. "What did he say?" "Enough to confirm he's working for Martinez," I said. But he clammed up when I pressed for details. Bill sighed, crouching down in front of the intruder. "You've got two choices," he said. "Talk to us now, or wait for Martinez to decide you're a liability. You think he's going to protect you when the heat comes down? Or are you just another loose end?" The guy stayed silent, but I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Bill pressed harder. "We got the story out there," he said. "You're already in the spotlight. If Martinez thinks you'll talk, you're done. But if you cooperate, we might be able to keep you breathing. Your call." The man swallowed hard, his confidence crumbling. Finally, he spoke. "It's bigger than Martinez," he said, his voice barely audible. "He's just a middleman." "For who?" I asked, leaning in. The man hesitated, then muttered a name I hadn't expected to hear. "Vega." Bill and I exchanged a glance. Raul Vega was a ghost, a cartel figure so elusive that even whispers of his name carried weight. If he was behind this, Martinez and Valdez were small-time players in a much larger game. "You've got no idea what you're messing with," the man said, his voice trembling now. Vega's got reach. You won't stop him. We don't need to stop him, I said. We just need to blow his operation wide open. The cops arrived not long after, carting the man off in handcuffs. Bill stayed behind, pacing the living room while I poured us both a stiff drink. This is getting out of hand, he said, downing the whiskey in one gulp. Vega's not someone you poke without expecting to lose a hand. I'm not poking, I said. I'm swinging for the head. Bill shook his head. You're going to get yourself killed, Keegan. And for what? For David, I said, my voice firm. For Elizabeth. For Brian. They deserve the truth. And if Vega comes after them? Bill asked, his tone cutting. You think you can protect them from him? I have to, I said, my jaw tightening. Because no one else will. The stakes had never been higher. With Vega's name in play, the fight wasn't just about exposing Martinez and Valdez anymore. It was about survival. Mine, David's, and Elizabeth's. And if I had to burn the whole damn operation to the ground to protect them, I would. The house was silent after Bill left, the kind of silence that presses on your chest and reminds you just how alone you are. The name Raul Vega echoed in my mind like a warning bell, growing louder with every passing moment. He wasn't a name you tossed around lightly. If he was involved, this thing had gone from dangerous to deadly. I leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the empty whiskey glass in my hand. My phone buzzed, pulling me back. It was Elizabeth. Are you okay? She asked, her voice sharp with worry. I saw the news about the break-in. I'm fine, I said, keeping my tone even. They didn't get far. David saw the story too, she said. He's scared, Richard. He thinks something's going to happen to you. I closed my eyes, the weight of it settling deep in my chest. Nothing's going to happen to me. I'm not going anywhere. You can't promise that, she said, her voice trembling. Not with people like this. You need to stop. I can't, I said. Not now. Why? Why can't you just let it go? Because Brian didn't die for nothing, I said, my voice hard. Because these people ruined his life, and they're trying to ruin ours. Someone has to stop them. She was silent for a moment. And what happens to David if you don't come back? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't have an answer. The next morning, I met Bill at a diner on the edge of town. He looked as tired as I felt, a half-empty cup of coffee in front of him. We got a problem, he said as I slid into the booth. Only one, I asked, forcing a grin. This Vega lead, it's got a lot of heat, he said, ignoring the sarcasm. Words already spreading. If we're not careful, we'll be dead before we get close to him. Then we need to move fast, I said. What do we have on him? Bill sighed, pulling a file from his bag. Not much. The guy's a ghost. No photos, no records. He uses layers of people to keep his hands clean. Martinez and Valdez are just another layer. There's got to be a crack somewhere, I said, flipping through the sparse file. There is, Bill said, tapping a page in the file. Martinez has been funneling money into an account tied to a company in Mexico. The company's a shell, but it's been linked to shipments moving through the port. Drugs, guns, you name it. I nodded. And the shipments lead back to Vega. Exactly, Bill said. But we need proof. Something concrete that ties Martinez, Valdez, and Vega together. Then we go to the port, I said. We find the shipment. Bill shook his head. You realize what you're saying, right? This isn't a stakeout. It's a suicide mission. Maybe, I said, but it's our only shot. That night, I left a note on the kitchen counter. Just a few lines scrawled on a piece of paper. If anything happens to me, call Bill. He knows what to do. It wasn't much, but it was all I could leave behind. I grabbed my Glock, my phone, and the file Bill had given me, then headed out. The port was quiet when I arrived, the air thick with the smell of salt and diesel. Bill was already there, parked in a black SUV a block away. He rolled down the window as I approached. You sure about this? He asked. No, I admitted, but we're doing it anyway. We moved through the shadows, keeping to the edges of the loading docks. The warehouse we were looking for was on the far side of the port, its lights glowing faintly through the fog. Inside, the air was cool and damp, the faint hum of refrigeration units filling the space. Rows of shipping containers stretched out before us, each one marked with codes and numbers. Bill pulled out a tablet, scrolling through the records we'd lifted from Martinez's office. Container 1487, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Third row, near the back. We found it quickly. The container's massive doors locked with a heavy padlock. Bill pulled out a set of bolt cutters, the metal snapping with a muffled clang. Inside, the smell hit first, chemicals and rot. The container was packed with crates, each one marked with fake company logos. Bill pried one open, revealing tightly wrapped bricks of white powder. Drugs. A lot of them. This is it, Bill said. This ties Martinez to Vega. I pulled out my phone and started snapping photos, documenting everything. But as I moved to the back of the container, I found something else. A small stack of ledgers, tucked away under a tarp. Jackpot, I muttered, flipping through the pages. Each ledger was filled with transactions, names, and dates. Proof of the entire operation. Let's get out of here, Bill said, his tone urgent. We stepped out of the container, but the sound of voices stopped us cold. A group of men stood at the far end of the warehouse, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Move, I whispered, pushing Bill toward the nearest exit. We slipped through the shadows, the sound of footsteps and voices growing closer. My heart was pounding, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. As we reached the exit, a flashlight beam caught the edge of my shoe. A shout rang out, followed by the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Go! I yelled, shoving Bill through the door. We sprinted through the loading docks, bullets whizzing past us. My truck was parked just beyond the gates, and I dove behind it as Bill slid into the passenger seat. Drive, he shouted, and I slammed the gas. We made it out, but barely. As I sped away from the port, the weight of what we'd found settled over me. We had the proof, but we just painted targets on our backs the size of billboards. Now what? Bill asked, his voice shaky. Now we finish this, I said. Once and for all. The truck roared down the highway, the engine groaning as I pushed it harder than I should have. The ledgers and photos were stuffed into a duffel bag on the floor between Bill's feet. The evidence we'd collected could burn the entire operation to the ground, but getting it into the right hands without getting killed first was going to be the real trick. Pull over, Bill said suddenly, his voice sharp. What? Why? I asked, glancing at him. They'll expect us to head straight home, he said. We need to switch cars. Now! I nodded, veering off the highway and onto a service road that led to a strip of abandoned warehouses. The truck rattled to a stop, and we both climbed out. Bill grabbed the duffel bag, his eyes scanning the shadows. Got a plan? I asked. Yeah, he said, pulling a set of keys from his jacket. I stashed a sedan in one of these warehouses. Figured we might need a backup. Smart, I said, following him as he led me to a rusted metal door. He pushed it open, revealing a battered gray car hidden under a tarp. It wasn't much to look at, but it'd get the job done. As we transferred the evidence and climbed into the sedan, Bill glanced at me. You know this isn't over, right? Vega's not going to let us walk away. I know, I said, gripping the wheel, but I'm not stopping. The safe house was a small cabin deep in the woods, an old hunting lodge Bill's brother owned. The place smelled like pine and mildew, but it was isolated, exactly what we needed. I parked the sedan behind the cabin, out of sight, and we hauled the duffel bag inside. Bill spread the ledgers and photos across the dining table, his face grim as he flipped through the pages. This is enough to bury them, he said. Martinez, Valdez, Vega. All of them. Good, I said, pacing the room. Then we make the call. To who? Bill asked. The feds? The press? Both, I said. We need to hit them from every angle. If they try to bury this, someone else will dig it up. Bill nodded, pulling out his phone. I'll call my contact at the DOJ. You get in touch with your reporter friend. By the time the calls were made, the weight of what we were doing started to sink in. This wasn't just a gamble. It was a full-on war. The reporter agreed to meet us in a neutral location to collect the evidence, while Bill's DOJ contact promised to send agents to secure the ledgers. But promises were just words. Until we saw action, I wasn't letting my guard down. The next morning, Elizabeth called. Her voice was tight, panicked. Richard, someone was outside the house last night. What do you mean? I asked, gripping the phone tighter. David saw them, she said. A man in black. just standing in the yard. When I turned on the porch light, he ran. "Is David okay?" I asked. "He's scared," she said. "I don't know what to do." "Pack a bag," I said. "Take David and go to the cabin. Bill and I are already here. You'll be safe." She hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll be here," I said. "And I'll make damn sure no one gets close to you or David." Elizabeth and David arrived a few hours later, her SUV kicking up dust as it pulled into the clearing. David climbed out first, his eyes scanning the woods nervously. Elizabeth followed, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. "You didn't have to drag us into this," she said as she approached me. "We were fine before." "No, you weren't." I cut her off. "They've been watching you for weeks, Elizabeth. Ignoring it won't make it go away." She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I just want this to be over." "So do I," I said. "But the only way out is through." That night, we hunkered down in the cabin, the tension thick enough to choke on. David sat in a corner with his headphones on, trying to block out the world. Elizabeth paced the room, her arms crossed. Bill sat at the table, his Glock within arm's reach. "Think they'll come here?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They'll try," I said, "but we'll be ready." The hours dragged by, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin's wooden frame. My grip on the Glock tightened every time a shadow shifted outside the window. But nothing came, until 3 a.m. A low rumble echoed through the trees, the unmistakable sound of engines. I moved to the window, peeking through the curtain. 2 black SUVs rolled into the clearing, their headlights cutting through the darkness. "They're here," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Get David into the back room. Now!" Elizabeth grabbed David's arm, pulling him toward the hallway. Bill moved to the other window, his expression grim. "How many?" he asked. 2 SUVs, I said. "At least 4 guys. Maybe more." Bill nodded. "We've got the high ground. Let's make it count." The first gunshot shattered the quiet, followed by the roar of engines as the SUVs barreled toward the cabin. Bill and I opened fire, the sound deafening in the small space. The first SUV skidded to a stop, its windshield spiderwebbed with cracks. The second vehicle swerved, its tires kicking up dirt as it tried to flank us. "They're spreading out," Bill shouted, reloading his weapon. I moved to the back door, keeping low. Shadows flickered through the trees as the men advanced, their guns flashing in the dark. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. One of them came too close, his silhouette outlined by the glow of the cabin's porch light. I fired, the shot connecting with his shoulder. He dropped, his weapon clattering to the ground. "They're pulling back," Bill yelled, but I wasn't ready to celebrate. The sound of footsteps on the roof sent my heart racing. They were trying to get in from above. "Stay here," I shouted to Bill, rushing toward the ladder that led to the attic. The attic ladder creaked under my weight as I climbed, Glock in hand. The footsteps on the roof grew louder, deliberate, like whoever was up there wanted me to hear them. I moved slowly, staying low as my head cleared the attic floor. The small space was lit only by the faint glow of moonlight filtering through a dusty vent. The air smelled of wood and old insulation, and my pulse hammered in my ears. I scanned the rafters, listening for any movement above. Then I heard a metallic scrape directly over me. I aimed the Glock toward the vent. A shadow moved across the light, and then there was a loud thud as someone dropped down through the roof hatch, landing in a crouch. "Don't move," I barked, the gun leveled at his chest. The man froze, his face hidden by a black balaclava. He was armed, a suppressed pistol clutched in his gloved hand. But he hesitated, his head tilting slightly, as if assessing me. "You made a mistake coming here," I said, my voice low but firm. "Drop the weapon." He didn't answer, but his body tensed, the kind of tension that comes right before someone does something stupid. I didn't give him the chance. I fired once, the shot echoing through the attic. He stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, his weapon falling to the floor. Before I could move, another shadow appeared at the hatch. This one wasn't subtle. He jumped down with a roar, swinging the butt of his rifle in my direction. I ducked, the blow missing my head by inches, and fired again. The shot hit his leg, and he crumpled with a howl, his rifle skidding across the floor. I kicked it away, backing toward the ladder. "You're done," I said, the Glock still trained on the first man. "Tell your friends outside it's over, or the next one doesn't miss." The first man grunted, his free hand pressed against his bleeding shoulder. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," I said. "Now drop the attitude before I put another hole in you." The second man groaned, clutching his leg, but neither of them moved to comply. I didn't wait for a response. I grabbed the rifle, keeping my Glock trained on them, and backed down the ladder. When I reached the ground floor, Bill was waiting, his own weapon trained on the door. "What happened?" he asked, glancing at the rifle in my hand. "Two on the roof," I said. "They're down but not out." "More outside," Bill said grimly. "They're regrouping." A crash echoed from the back of the cabin, followed by the sound of splintering wood. They were trying to break through. I moved toward the hallway, finding Elizabeth and David huddled in the back room. Elizabeth's face was pale, but her eyes were sharp, defiant. David was sitting on the floor, his arms wrapped around his knees. "They're coming in," I said, my voice steady. "Stay here. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me or Bill." Elizabeth nodded, pulling David closer. "Be careful." I didn't respond. There was no time for promises I might not be able to keep. Back in the main room, Bill had taken cover behind the overturned dining table, his Glock aimed at the shattered back door. The attackers had breached the perimeter, and their footsteps echoed on the wooden floorboards. "They're inside," Bill said, his voice low. "We're outnumbered." "Then we even the odds," I said, taking position behind a stack of crates near the kitchen. The first man stepped into the room, his rifle sweeping the area. He was cautious, but he didn't see Bill tucked behind the table. Bill fired once, the shot hitting the man square in the chest. He dropped, his weapon clattering to the floor. "Three more," Bill called out as more footsteps thundered through the cabin. I fired at the second man, the shot grazing his arm. He ducked behind the couch, returning fire with a suppressed pistol. The sound was muffled, but the impact of the bullets splintering the crates near my head was all too real. Bill took out the third man, his shot precise. The attacker crumpled to the floor, his rifle skidding across the room. But the fourth man, bigger and more heavily armed, burst in with a shotgun, his roar deafening in the confined space. The blast from the shotgun shattered the window behind me, sending shards of glass raining down. I rolled to the side, firing twice. One shot missed, but the second hit his thigh, and he went down with a growl of pain. The cabin fell silent, the air heavy with the smell of gunpowder and sweat. Bill and I moved cautiously, checking each downed attacker to make sure they weren't getting back up. "We clear?" I asked, my voice tight. "Looks like it," Bill said, reloading his Glock. "But we need to move. They'll send reinforcements." I nodded, my mind racing. Help me drag these guys outside. Leave them for the authorities. We worked quickly, hauling the attackers into the clearing outside the cabin. By the time we were done, my arms were trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. Inside, Elizabeth and David were waiting, their faces pale but determined. "Is it over?" Elizabeth asked. "For now," I said, "but we can't stay here. It's not safe anymore." "Where do we go?" she asked. "To the press," I said. "We got the evidence. It's time to put it all out there." David looked at me, his eyes wide but steady. "Are they going to come after us again?" "They might," I said honestly, "but we're not running anymore. This ends now." The next morning, we packed what we could and left the cabin behind. The attackers were gone by the time the sheriff arrived, but the damage was done. There was no going back to hiding. The evidence we had, the story we'd built, and the blood spilled made one thing clear. This was going to end, one way or another. The meeting point was a secure hotel room in the city. The reporter, Rachel, was waiting when we arrived, along with Bill's contact from the DOJ, a no-nonsense agent named Cruz. The room felt tense, the weight of what we were about to do pressing down on everyone. Rachel spread the ledgers and photos across the table, her eyes wide as she examined them. "This is massive," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of excitement and fear. "If this gets out, it's going to blow up everything." That's the idea, I said. Agent Cruz was less enthusiastic. You realize what you're risking here? Vega isn't going to take this lying down. I'm counting on it, I said. The more noise we make, the harder it'll be for him to hide. The plan was simple, but dangerous. Release the evidence to the press and the DOJ simultaneously, flooding the channels with so much information that no one could suppress it. Rachel would publish the story, while Cruz would use the ledgers to launch an official investigation. It was a race against time to put the spotlight on Vega before his people could retaliate. We uploaded the files to secure servers, triple encrypting the data to ensure it couldn't be intercepted. By the time we hit send, the story was already live, the headline blazing across news sites. Inside the Vega network, decades of corruption exposed. The first wave of backlash came within hours. Martinez's office was raided by federal agents, his offshore accounts frozen. Valdez went underground, but his name was plastered across every major news outlet. And Vega? Vega stayed silent, his network scrambling as their carefully constructed empire began to crumble. But silence didn't mean safety. I knew he wasn't done. 2 days later, the storm came to us. It started with a call from Rachel. They're following me, she said, her voice shaking. I think they're trying to scare me off. Stay somewhere crowded, I told her. Don't go home. Next was Cruz. Keegan, we've got a problem. One of our agents tailing Valdez went dark. We think they've made him. And Vega? I asked. He's gone completely off-grid, Cruz said. But trust me, he's watching. That night, I sat with David in the small hotel room we'd moved to for safety. Elizabeth was in the adjoining room, her voice low as she talked to Bill about contingency plans. David sat on the bed, flipping through the TV channels aimlessly. Hey, I said, sitting beside him. You holding up okay? He shrugged. This is a lot. Yeah, I said. It is. He looked at me, his eyes searching. Do you ever, I don't know, regret getting involved in this? I thought about it for a moment. Sometimes, I admitted, but not for the reasons you think. I regret that you and your mom are in danger because of this. But if I walked away, they'd still be out there. People like Vega don't stop unless someone makes them. David nodded slowly. Do you think we'll be okay? I don't know, I said honestly. But I'm going to do everything I can to make sure we are. The final confrontation came a week later. It wasn't planned, it never is. A tip came through Cruz's office, an informant with ties to Vega's network willing to talk. The meet was in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, the kind of place you'd expect to double-cross. Bill and I went in first, Cruz and his team waiting nearby. The informant, a nervous man with a scar running down his cheek, stood near a stack of crates, his hands trembling. You have something for us? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Vega's not happy, the man said. He's planning to disappear, but before he does, he wants to send a message. What kind of message? Bill asked. The man hesitated. You. The lights cut out, plunging the warehouse into darkness. The sound of boots echoed, followed by the unmistakable click of safeties being released. Down! I shouted, diving behind a crate as gunfire erupted. The air filled with the crack of bullets and the shouts of men. Bill returned fire, his Glock barking in the dark. Cruz's team stormed in moments later, their flashlights cutting through the chaos. It was a blur of motion, gunfire, shadows moving, the acrid smell of smoke. I spotted one of Vega's men trying to flank us and dropped him with 2 quick shots. Another tried to rush Bill, but Cruz's team intercepted him. The firefight ended as quickly as it began. When the dust settled, 3 of Vega's men were down, and the rest had fled. The informant was gone, his betrayal cutting deeper than the gunfire. In the aftermath, the DOJ launched a full-scale takedown of Vega's network. Martinez and Valdez were arrested within days. Their operations dismantled piece by piece. Vega himself remained elusive, but the damage was done. His empire was shattered, his power stripped away. For the first time, I felt like we'd won. But it didn't come without a price. Back at the hotel, Elizabeth hugged me tightly, her voice shaking. It's over. For now, I said, but we'll never stop looking over our shoulders. David stood nearby, his expression unreadable. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did it," I corrected. "All of us." As the weeks passed, the dust began to settle. Elizabeth and David moved back home, their lives slowly returning to something resembling normal. Bill and I stayed in touch, but we both knew the fight had taken its toll. One night, as I sat on the porch with a whiskey in hand, David joined me. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there, staring at the stars. "Thanks," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "For what?" I asked. "For not giving up," he said. "On me. On Mom. On everything." I nodded, the weight of his words settling deep. That's what family does. And for the first time in years, I felt like I belonged to one again.